Hello and welcome to your first After Effects session, at least this quarter and maybe even ever. In these sessions, I want to teach you how to work with After Effects and how to use the different aspects that After Effects offers us to work in. For instance, motion graphics, but also visual effects, and icon animation for websites, or essentially anything that has to do with moving images that is not 3D. 3D is something that we will talk about next quarter. Before we get started with this, let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Leonard. It's a real shame that we can't meet yet, but I hope that we will soon, and I would love for you to get in touch with me via email and set up a quick Zoom call just so that we have a private chat and just get to know each other a little bit. I have been a Miami Ed School student myself many years ago, and I've been teaching for around 10 years by now. I teach After Effects, I teach Cinema 4D and Blender, although these years we're more focusing on Blender because it's better. Blender and Cinema 4D are 3D applications. We'll talk about it next quarter, as I said. And I also help with building the online portfolios, both for the third quarters as well as for the 8th quarter. I am a freelance motion designer, a web developer, and I also do a couple of other things on the side. Anything that has to do with digital stuff. In these sessions, we will usually have the following process. I show something, you always follow along. Sometimes I explain a little bit more, sometimes it's a little bit more straightforward. After the session, we will always have a project that we have finished. And I need you to send me a proof of attendance. And that is usually either a screenshot or the rendered version of what we did during that class. Then there will usually be a homework assignment. That homework assignment is always due the day before the next session. Because of time zones and everything, I'm kind of loose. I'm not saying it has to be like by 12 a.m., p.m., a.m., midnight or something like this in my time zone. So just on your time zone, sometime during the day before our next session, the homework needs to be handed in. I make a list of everyone that sends in the proof of attendance as well as the homeworks. I will save everything, and all of that will incorporate, is that the word? Into the grade that you will get at the end of the quarter. And of course, there will be a face-to-face assignment. The face-to-face assignment will take up about 50% of the grade, and the other 50% are the way that you participate in the classes by showing up, sending the proof of attendance, and of course, how you manage the homework assignments. During the session, if you ever have any questions, feel free to write me either via email or preferably via WhatsApp. I have my number and of course email address attached to this mail. Do I attach my email address to the mail? That doesn't really make sense, does it? You already see who sent it. Anyway, so WhatsApp is usually my preferred method of communicating. I might switch over to Slack since because of the Berlin campus, the new one, we're doing a lot of more Slacking, and I know that some other teachers do it, but currently I still prefer WhatsApp. We just have a little bit more options and it feels a little bit more natural for most people. So when you work through this session, usually these sessions are around 1 hour long, and it will take you between 2 to 4 hours to finish it, because you always need to pause, go back, and kind of like repeat the process. I recommend, if you have the option to have 2 screens, however you do that, use that so that you have one screen where you have my recording open. Could be an iPad, could be another Mac or whatever, or even your phone. Although on a phone it might be a little bit hard. I try to zoom into things whenever I remember, just to kind of like focus on stuff that is important, but sometimes I forget. So if you watch the recording on your phone, it might be a little bit hard to follow. But if you do have a 2-screen setup, I definitely recommend doing that. It will be a lot easier than always switching back and forth between the video and your screen. Because After Effects, as you can already see in the background, has a very detailed interface, and it will only get worse from here. Speaking of After Effects, the first thing that we will do is set up the language so that we can make sure that everyone's kind of like on the same page. Then we will take care of the preferences so that everyone is also on the same page there. And then we will finally start with our little project that I will try to remember to link here or something. It's just a very small animation of comparing how the different types of keyframes in After Effects work. So today's session will be kind of boring, but the future sessions will be a little bit more interesting. I will usually always show the end result of the class at the beginning of the class, so you kind of see what you're getting into for the next hour. All right, did I forget anything? Maybe, probably, but I would say let's grab a coffee or a tea and let's get started. Okay, so as I said, the first thing that we want to take care of is the language. And in After Effects, we actually have two ways of changing the language to English. I will first show you the way that works for all applications, but it's a little bit more annoying. And then I will show you kind of like a quick tip or a hidden feature where we can change the language for After Effects on any machine within seconds. Okay, so the general way is to just change the language of your Creative Cloud application. You do that by opening up the Creative Cloud application here. Good. Then you go to your, zooming in, you go to your account settings, scroll down. By the way, don't use this email address. Adobe got hacked a couple of years back and so much shit got leaked. So I gave them an email address that I don't use because I don't trust them anymore. By the way, during our sessions, you might notice that I'm not a big fan of Adobe. Like, I use the applications, but I just know them too well, and I know where all the bodies are hidden. Anyways, go to your preferences. Then, in the preferences, switch over to Apps, scroll down, and there you can see the default install language. Now, I've set mine to America, or North America. I think they also have English International. To be honest, I don't quite know what the difference is. I never saw mine to be different than others, so I just stick to the North American one. Now, when you change this just means which language will be used when you install an application. So all the applications that you already have installed are still in the language that they are. If you want it to be switched, you need to uninstall the application, reinstall it, and then the newly installed application will have the correct language. Because preferences files are saved in the language of the application, it often might mean that when you install the application in another language, all your preferences are lost. This has nothing to do with your file, so they are safe, they don't look different, everything should stay the same. It's just some of the preferences of your application that might be different or reset back to the defaults. Shouldn't be too hard to switch it or to fix that though. All right, this is something that I definitely recommend everyone doing because most of our classes or most of the applications that you use in Adobe are just so much better to use in English. You will find many more resources online, and oftentimes the translations are just awful. So for After Effects, you will really have a hard time to follow if your application is set, for instance, in German. Now, if you, however, work at a German agency or something, then it might not be your choice at which language the applications are installed on the computer that you're using there. It might be in German, which then makes it really hard to work with it. Now, every application kind of has their fixes that you can do. Some of them need admin privileges. So for instance, for Photoshop, I think you need to go into the application itself, like in the application folder, and change a file there so it resets to English. I don't know about the other application. Just Google it. For After Effects, however, we can change the language on any system without any administration rights, because you just need to create a file in the user's documents folder. And that's something where you can always put files. The process for Windows and Mac are essentially the same. Let me show you how that works. First, let's open up TextEdit. That is almost great. What kind of page is this? TextEdit. There we go. If you're on Windows, you will use, probably I suggest using Notepad, which is the default kind of like text editing tool on Windows. Notepad already has a plain formatted text. On Mac, in TextEdit, we have a rich text format. So we need to switch that real quick by going up here to Format and then choose Make Plain Text. Then we go to File, Save, and you will go to the Documents folder. You can see that I already have this file in here, but let me just create it again. It needs to be called AE_force_English.txt. And that is all that you need. Just a file that is called AE_force_English.txt in this folder here. The next time you will start After Effects, it will start in English. But, as I said, for many applications, just like with After Effects, your preferences are saved in a specific language. So if you've used After Effects before and you had some preferences set in your German version of After Effects, these preferences are reset and you start with a fresh installation of After Effects essentially. Speaking of preferences, let's take a look at that right now. Alright, so when you're on a Mac, you go up here to After Effects and then choose Preferences and just use the general preferences to start with. On Windows, if I remember correctly, you will find that menu under Edit and then somewhere down here. Let's start with the general preferences. There are not many things that we actually want to change, but they are quite integral to the kind of like behavior of After Effects. It's not so bad, but still, there are just many things that we might want to adjust to make working a little bit easier. Number one is this option here, Use Systems Shortcuts. By default, I think this is disabled, and this affects the Command M and Command H commands. So usually when you hit Command H, the application is hidden, and Command M to minimize the application. This goes for Mac only. I think for Windows we don't have this option because we don't need it. Now when we hover over it, we can see kind of like a tooltip. Come on. Or not. Why doesn't the tooltip show up? It usually does. Maybe because I'm zoomed in. Maybe because it's confused now. I just did this earlier. I was working just fine. Fuckers. Let me just try to open it again. Crazy. Never had that issue. But of course I have the issue when I record. Anyways, the system shortcuts are Command H and Command M. By default, After Effects uses this to replace footage items and to to send something to the render queue in order to render out a video project that we have built. You can switch between these shortcuts by enabling this. So when this is enabled, then Command M and Command H do what the shortcuts usually do. So minimizing and hiding the application. I usually have this turned off because we use the Command M shortcut quite a lot, and the alternative is, if this is turned on, you need to hold down Command Control M, and that's just a lot harder to do. So my recommendation is keeping this turned off, and that means if you then want to hide or minimize the application, you need to hold the Control key on top of this. So Command Control H to hide and Command Control M to minimize. All right. Let's go to the next ones. I think previews and display we can skip. For the import, the default frames per second for sequence footage is 30 frames per second. Here, simply click on it and type in 25. This means when you have a sequence, so multiple images that should make up a video together, then it will be imported with the default frame rate of 25 frames per second. For most projects that we will work on, we will work with 25 frames per second, so it's good that when we import footage, something created in 3D or gotten from somewhere else, that it's by default 25 frames per second. Then output is fine, this is fine, this is fine. The media and disk cache. By default it is enabled and it can take up a lot of space. You can see on my case, for instance, in my case, it takes up 100 gigabytes of space. Usually, we don't have the luxury on the laptops to have something take up this much space. The thought of the disk cache was good. Adobe tried to do something to optimize the speed of working with After Effects, but I had more issues with this than solutions that I got. So I usually disable it and make sure that I empty the disk cache. Many people are irritated by how much space it takes up, especially because it's in the library and you can't really quickly find where that issue is unless you have specific applications that find where large files are. And they're not even large files. The cache is made up of thousands of tiny files. So anyway, my recommendation is turning it off. If you are interested in how this works, just let me know. Then I will take care of it, and I will explain to you why this exists, but I don't think that it's that necessary. Just trust me and disable it. Then video previews are fine. Appearance, there's one function that they added, and that is cycle mask colors. You can think of it like in Photoshop when you create vector masks, if you've ever done that. So in After Effects, we can mask out things to add transparency information to objects, and we do that with paths. And each path by default has a color. And this cycle mask colors make sure that every path that you create, just visually while you create it, has a different color. And that is very annoying because the colors that they've chosen are awful, and you can hardly distinguish them from backgrounds because they tend to use the colors that the background has. Not on purpose. This happens on accident. They use pastel colors. It's the worst idea they ever had. Or no, the idea itself was good, just the execution was really bad and they never fixed it. So this option should be turned off. It makes your life so much easier. New project settings are fine. Autosave, you should turn autosave on because After Effects is not the most stable application, which is in part due to bad programming on After Effects sides, but also due to the fact that it's a very complex application and the operating system might just mess up, and because of issues with the operating system, it causes After Effects to crash. Since you usually work on After Effects for extended periods of times and you have big things that you've done in there that take a lot of time to replicate, I really recommend turning on autosave. After Effects files themselves are pretty small because everything inside of them is just linked. It's kind of like an InDesign file. In Photoshop, when you import something, the file gets larger and larger and larger, so you can have files that are gigabytes in size. For After Effects, we usually stay within a couple of megabytes for the sizes of After Effects, so 1 to maybe 50 megabytes for a file, even if you have an entire case film that is 2 minutes long. My preferred settings are save every 5 minutes and a maximum project version 10. This means if I, for instance, take my After Effects file and I save it on the desktop, after 5 minutes it will create a folder that is called After Effects Autosave. In that folder it will save the first autosave version. Then every 5 minutes that I don't save my files on my own, it will create a new version of the file in this autosave folder. So after 50 minutes, we will have 10 files in the autosave folder. If an 11th file would be created, it starts by killing off the first one. So we will always have a maximum of 10 files in there, which means we can always go 50 minutes back in time. So if you mess up something and you realize, damn it, I deleted something and I want to get it back, you can just go to the autosave folder and open up an older version of your file. Next, we have memory. I usually recommend keeping the settings as default. Depending on how much RAM you have, it has different presets, how much RAM is reserved for other applications, and Adobe usually does a good job in managing the RAM. So don't mess stuff up there. The rest of the settings should be fine, and the last thing that you want to change is this one here. Allow scripts to write files and access network. This means that when you have a script or plugin installed, it's allowed to, for instance, save preferences or create files if necessary. This also means that theoretically, scripts have access to your entire system, which is a huge security risk. So at some companies that you might work at, they prohibit you to enable this option because it's a huge security issue. Now, as long as you stick to proper plugins and scripts from proper sources, you should not have issues. I've never heard of any script exploiting the security flaw that this function has, but in theory it's possible. So when working with After Effects, I encourage you not to use cracked software, plugins or scripts, because they might do awful shit. In theory, they could grab all of your files, upload them to a server, and delete all of the files on your system. I don't know why they would do that, because you are not important enough. But in theory, they could. So you should be aware of that and not mess with illegal plugins on your system when working with After Effects. All right. Now, this option is very important because many plugins that we might use need this function to be enabled. Otherwise, a plugin is not able to save preferences, for instance. So every time you open it up, it would start from scratch. Or some plugins have functionalities that have to have this enabled in order to actually work at all. If a plugin needs it, it will give you a warning. It starts up and then it tells you this option needs to be enabled. So yeah, just enable it right now and then you don't have issues in the future. Alrighty. Lastly, the interface. The default interface usually looks like this, and it's basically fine. Just the parts on the right side here are a little bit annoying. Well, that's just my personal preference. So we have these tabs, and whenever you click on them, they kind of expand, but you can see how the sizes are always changing, and it's just, I don't know, I don't like it. I rather have multiple tabs open at the same time and have the control over what is visible and not always have to click on things. To switch this, just go up here from default to standard. You can see how this is essentially the same layout. It just adds a couple of additional things here already. Let me actually reset this to the default. Oh yeah, by the way, if you ever move something around and stuff is messed up and looks kind of like, oh no, everything's wrong and you can't find shit anymore, don't worry. Just go to the menu icon here and then say reset to saved layout. And then it resets it back to the default and all the panels are back. So especially when starting with After Effects, it's very easy to, for instance, accidentally get rid of the composition window, and that is one of the most important ones because that's essentially your viewport or your editor or your canvas, however you want to call it. In other applications like Photoshop, Illustrator, you cannot get rid of this. It's the main part of your system. In After Effects, this is just an optional thing because you might want to take this and put it on another screen. So After Effects usually or oftentimes is used on multiple screens, so they have a lot of options to move all the panels around and work with multiple windows of the same application. So here, for instance, I could take my timeline and I could undock the panel, and now it's a floating window that I can just move onto another screen. It's independent from my interface. Because After Effects is so fluent, it's also very easy to mess up and lose your way. And you might not know how to get the panels back. Like all the panels, you can just get back by going up to Window and then find the panel in here. But then you need to dock it and then things get really weird. So my recommendation is simply going up here. And if that one doesn't exist anymore for some reason, you can just go up here to Window, Workspace, and then choose the Reset Standard to Saved Layout option here. And then everything is back and we're good to go. All right, enough talking. Let's get started with doing something. Now, the first thing that we want to create is a so-called composition. A composition is kind of like, it's not an artboard, it's more like a file, but we can have multiple compositions inside of one After Effects project. There are many ways of creating a composition, and there are actually many ways of doing similar things or the same things in After Effects. I will usually show you all the different ways that you can create something or change a setting, and then you can decide which of the options you prefer. Now, the first time you open up After Effects, or just in general after you start After Effects, you have this big button here where you can create a new composition. When you click it, you get a window pop up with settings for the composition, but after you created it, if you want to create a new composition, you don't have this button here anymore. So let's just undo this. The alternative to this button here is to go to Composition and create a new composition up here. There you can also see that it has a shortcut, Command N. Then there's another option, and that is, by going all the way down here and using the similar icon. You see, and this icon here is similar to that one. And when you click it, the same pop-up appears. Ta-da! So we have the big button in the center, we have the compositions panel, the composition menu item, we have the shortcut, and we have the tiny button down here. All end up with the same pop-up over here. Now there are a couple of things that we want to change. First, it's the preset. This defines what is the size that we're working in, what is the pixel aspect ratio, and what is the frame rate that we're using. All of these things are very important because it's very hard to change it later on. It's kind of like when you need to create something for RGB, and then later on you realize, damn it, you've set up the project in CMYK. Then all of your colors are messed up because CMYK just doesn't have all the colors that RGB has available. And then when you switch, you might lose some information. No, it's the other way around. Anyway. It's also kind of like when you are in Photoshop and you create a canvas and you mask out some masks, and then you realize, oh, you need to extend the canvas. And then you realize that all of your masks are cut off. Do you know what I'm saying? You probably don't. I don't know how much stuff you work with Photoshop. Just trust me, these values you do not want to change later on, because then things mess up and get really annoying. So you want to make sure that you start with a document that has an appropriate size. And to keep things simple, we will use the one or the setting that to this day pretty much all of the projects are built in. Of course, 4K is getting more and more popular, but not for the kinds of things that we're doing. So just stick to Full HD and we're good. Oh yeah, by the way, this is referenced as Full HD. Now in After Effects, the preset is called HDTV 1080-25. If you click on it, you can scroll down and you can find it here. Be careful. Do not mistake it for the HDV 1080-25. They look very similar, but this one has a completely different size. And if you choose this, your entire project is fucked up and it's really hard to convert it to the correct one here. Like, not finding the right steps, it's a lot of manual steps for every single thing that you imported and placed and animated. So really make sure that you use the HDTV 1080-25 preset. I will repeat that every single time we create a composition because it's that important. So here you can see it's set up to be 1920 by 1080, which is an aspect ratio of 16 by 9. So the default, you might have heard these things before. The pixel aspect ratio always has to be square. If it's not square, then you did something wrong. If you later on work at an agency and you get raw footage from, for instance, an Alexa or a Red camera or something like this, then your pixel aspect ratio might be a little bit different. Since chances are pretty slim that you ever get into that situation, I will not talk about the differences here and how to properly work with them. I don't want to waste your time. The frame rate should be 25 frames per second, and I think the name already pretty much explains what it does. A video is made up of multiple frames, and yeah, the more frames we have, the smoother it looks, but also the more file size is needed. So usually 25 is a good compromise between it still looks smooth and the file size can be quite small. Then we have the resolution and the duration of our composition. The resolution can always be changed later on, and so does our duration. For the duration for today, let's just start with a composition that is 10 seconds long. When we take a look at this code here, we can see we have hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. If you want to change this, you can simply go in here and either change the separate parts, or if you're lazy, like I am, you can start with the largest value that you want to input, for instance, 5 minutes. Then, if you look to the right, you can see how it now thinks it's 5 frames. But if you add 2 more zeros, then it sees, haha, it's supposed to be 5 seconds. And if I add 2 more zeros, it knows it's supposed to be 5 minutes. When I now click outside, it creates the appropriate timecode for me. This is a very useful function. Also, for the people that noticed, if I type in 50, it says 2 and not 5 here, because 50 frames, we only have 2 inputs, right? So right now it thinks that these are frames, and 50 frames with a timecode of 25 frames per second equal 2 seconds. Make sense? Sure. All right, so let's add 10 seconds. Here at the bottom, we can then change the background color as well. For today, we will just keep it black, and usually I keep my background color to be black. This can always be changed later on. Then we hit OK. Now, I do want to not import any footage today. I will talk about it in our next session. So today we will just work with so-called solids. A solid is essentially just a rectangle. So there are a couple of things that After Effects can create. Like we even have paint brushes, but I would not recommend using them because things get really messy and complicated, since everything in After Effects is always procedural. So today we will only explore some parts of things that we can create, and one of them being a solid. The shortcut for creating a solid is Command Y. Alternatively, you can go up here to Layer, New, and choose the solid here. You can also see the shortcut there. And lastly, when you have your timeline down here, not here, but this part of the timeline is the Layers panel. There you can right click on it, go to New, and also choose to create a new solid. All of this opens up this panel here. For a new solid, we have the option to define the size and the pixel aspect ratio. And of course, the color. When I now hit OK, it has created a solid in the size of my composition. I can see how I have my layer over here and how it's placed in my composition. When I move it around, I can see, okay, so the black part was kind of like my canvas, and I can now move this around inside of the canvas. And when I grab these tiny corners here, I can click and drag them in order to scale the object. Now at this point, you might already notice that something weird is happening, or something unusual. Usually when we click at the top left corner, it scales down to the bottom right one. In After Effects, things are a little bit different. Since everything needs to be animated, an object needs to have a fixed anchor point. So one point of the object that defines where does it exist. And that is always in the center of the object. This means that everything that has to do with transforms will be calculated from this point. So if we reset the position of our object to 0, it will not be placed in the top left corner. It will be actually placed like this, with the anchor point in the top left corner where the 0, 0 place of the coordinate system is. If you wonder why is it in the top left corner, just take a look at any other Adobe application, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign. All of these applications, when you open up the rulers, Command R, you can see that they do start with 0 in the top left corner. Then the more you go to the right, the higher the values go, and the further you go down, the higher the values go. And this makes complete sense, but it is sometimes a little bit confusing to people when we work with these values, because usually you don't have to think about it, you just place something and then you're good. But with After Effects, we are animating these values to get it from one position to the other, so we need to be very mindful of how this system works. All right, speaking of these values, since we can animate them, we need to access them somehow, and we can do that directly on the layer itself. When we take a close look at the layer here, you can see that it has this tiny little arrow, and that means that they are properties alongside this layer. When you open it up, we can see that we have a property group called Transform. And when we open that one up, we can see how we have all these properties here. Oh. So we have anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. And on the side here, we can see what the actual values are. So when I hover over this, you can see how my cursor changes to this pointer thing. And this means that we are able to change this value either by clicking inside of it and then typing something in. So I could type in 0 and 0, for instance, and you can see how my object's anchor point has moved to the top left corner. Or I can click and drag these values. So the higher the X value is, the more it goes to the right, and the higher the Y value is, the more it goes down. Now the Y-axis usually takes people some getting used to, because they think if I increase the Y value, the object should move up, but that's not true, because our coordinate system starts in the top left corner, and by default it wants to have positive values. I hope this is clear so far. Then we can see we also have values that have different properties that are based on not pixels, but percent. This one here for the scale, for instance, is shown a little bit differently, because usually you want the scale to be equal. So it has this constraint enabled, but of course we can always reset it back to 0 or 100%, sorry. The rotation is a little bit more complex. Here we want to animate something and it might rotate more than once. Usually for objects, it doesn't matter how often times something is rotated, it only matters what rotation it has in the end. So for other applications, your rotation usually goes from 0 to 360, and then it starts over. In After Effects, we need to have so-called rounds. So here, if we increase this value over 360, you can see how it jumps back to 0, and then it adds 1 round. So this means it's rotated 1 time plus this many degrees. Okay, so let me reset this as well. And then lastly, we have the opacity, which works just like opacities do. All right, we also have the anchor point, and this defines from where are things calculated. So I could also say that I want my anchor point to be in the top left corner by clicking on here and typing in 0 and 0. Now you can see how the object moved behind the anchor point, because the anchor point is placed with a position. You don't need to understand this right now. But now that the anchor point is in the top left corner, I could move my position to the top left corner as well, and now it behaves a little bit more like I expect it to. And if I scale it, at least from the bottom right corner, it also scales the way that I expect it to. However, if I will try to scale it from the top left corner, it will not work. And if I scale it from any other corner, this also will not work the way that I would expect it to. So I recommend keeping the anchor point in the center, unless of course we need the anchor point to be in the top left corner, for instance, if we want to rotate it around that corner. To reset all the positions, you can either right-click on the object, go to Transform, and then choose Reset, or you can right click on the layer, do the same thing, transform and reset, or you can click on transform and reset, or you can click on each property individually, right click and reset the value to the default. You can even select multiple properties at the same time. I will do it again by selecting one of them, hold down Shift, click on another one, and then I will do a selection for all the ones in between, right click, and then choose reset. So all of this will end up doing the same thing. And by default, the solid scales up back to its original size of the size of my composition, and with the anchor point in the center. All right, so far so good. Now I think I will want to start, or actually here, what I've done is I've zoomed into the timeline. So here I can now see the entire timeline going from 0 all the way up to 10 seconds. But if I want to focus just on the first part here, I can use this slider to zoom in just so that I can see a smaller portion of my sequence. All right, let's actually start by deleting the solid. So just selecting it and hitting the delete key and creating a solid in a nicer color. What I've done is I went to color.adobe.com in order to just get some kind of color scheme that I can use. You can of course add it to your library, and then you should be able to find it in the library here. I've actually not done that in quite a while. Did I? And I don't really care. I don't really like these libraries. Nope. I don't want artwork. I just want my color swatches to be there. Usually what I do is, oops. I mean, I already have things in there. Shouldn't I be able to access them here? No. I don't really care. I should have prepared this. They have this one here. Does this show me the themes that I had? No, they are just a super awfully programmed panel of the other themes. Oh, but this one here should show the ones that I've saved. Oh yeah. I think these are the ones that I've saved at some point. Yeah. So essentially what you could do is you could use this, but I'm just too lazy. Either I use this one here. The sad thing is that in the newer version of this, or it's already been going on for a year, you cannot save this as a link. I don't know why. So I usually just take a screenshot of this, or by now you can also download it as a JPEG. I need to sign in again. Fuckers. Jesus. And now it's gone. This one was it. I don't want to have to sign in or anything. Yeah, I'll just keep this open and grab the colors from here. All right. So I grab the hex code, copy it. Then I go over to After Effects, hit Command Y to create a new solid. Click on the color here, which then gives me the color picker, and I can just paste in the hex code. And now this is my background color. Next, I want to create a smaller solid. So I copy the next color, hit Command Y. Here I want to make it a little bit smaller, maybe 100 by 100. And I paste in the color. And now I've created this little rectangle. Now I do want this to be a little bit more like a diamond shape, so I select it and I want to change the rotation. Now, of course, I could click on these ones here and always open them up one by one, but this gets very annoying because too many clicks. So After Effects has shortcuts for all of these properties so that you can easily access them. And the shortcuts are A for anchor point, P for position, so A, and then the anchor point is shown, P for position, S for scale, R for rotation. The opacity has a different shortcut. So usually you would think it should be O, but O is already reserved for the out point of a layer. So when I hit O, my slider jumps to the out point of the layer, and I goes to the in point of the layer. So these shortcuts were created first, so unfortunately our opacity has a different one, and the shortcut is T. Either like transparency or opacity. Anyways, we want to change the rotation, so we hit R. Then we go to the rotation here and set it to 90 degrees. No, 45 degrees. That's what I wanted. There we go, and now we have this kind of diamond shape. Then we can grab this layer and move it to where we want it to be, so probably somewhere over here. And what I just want to animate, as you've seen earlier, is simply have this layer go from left to right. To do that, we need to tell a property that it is keyframeable. Is that a word? I just invented it. So we go to P for the position, and we need to save this position over here, because I can't just say, okay, this is here, then I go forward in time, and then I move it over, and then nothing happened. So we need to tell After Effects at any point in time, so at any point in the timeline, save the changes that we're doing to a property. So we start again by placing this in the top left corner. Then we hit P, make sure that your slider is at the beginning of the timeline, and you click on the stopwatch. This will kind of like activate this property, and every time we change something, it will create this thing here, which is called a keyframe. So when I move my slider, I can see it created this diamond shape, which, by the way, has nothing to do with what we've created here. This is just on accident that it's a similar color and shape. So this is always how a keyframe looks like, as long as it's a linear one. Anyways, we can now go to 1 second. We can select the element. Oh yeah, by the way, I completely forgot to talk about it. Up here we have the main tools of selecting elements, moving our viewport, and zooming in and out of the viewport. We don't have a scrubby zoom like we know it from Photoshop and Illustrator. So if you click and drag, you just draw a window and you zoom into that window. If you want to reset the view, you simply go down here and choose fit, or fit up to 200. You can also switch between the move tool or selection tool by using the shortcut V, like you know it from any other application, and H to go to the hand tool, or of course you can hold down the space bar and click and drag at the same time. Be careful with the spacebar though, because spacebar, just hitting it, means that it should play back the timeline. Okay, so at the beginning of the timeline, we activated the stopwatch. Our first keyframe was generated automatically. We then go to second number 1, V for the move tool, and move this over to the right. As I'm clicking and dragging, I can also hold down the shift key, and it will constrain to the x-axis. Then I can release the mouse, and I can release the shift key. When we now scrub through, we can see how an animation is created, because here it saved the current position of this time in the timeline, and here it created a new keyframe where it saved the new position. And by default, After Effects creates a transition between these two properties. Alright, when we now hit the spacebar, we can see how this plays back. Perfect. Since we are only animating within this short range, what you can do is you can just go move your slider to maybe 1.5 seconds roughly, and you can define the out point of the work area, or the end of the work area. The work area is this marked area up here. And this marked area means what is the part that we are currently working in. So certain functions work in this specific area, like the playback. So when I now hit the spacebar, you can see how it plays back only within this range, and it will loop through, which is very convenient. That way we don't always have to play back, pause, and revert the timeline if we want to see something over and over again. Here we can drag the work area to be something like this. And when we then play it back, we can see this animation play back and then start over. This way, it's much easier to work and compare what you've done and see everything come together. The work area also has shortcuts to be set. The first one is B to set the beginning of the work area, and the second one is N to set the end of the work area. See, like N, it's like a pun. No, not funny. Just me. Okay. Anyways, so I go to the beginning of the timeline, hit B for the beginning, go to 1.5 seconds, and hit N for the end of the work area. Now that we have our first element animated, let's actually start by animating another one. We'll do the same process that we did before. We copy a color, hit Command Y to create a new solid, size is fine, click on the color, paste the code, hit OK, hit R for the rotation, and rotate it by 90 degrees. 45. Then we move it into place. If you want this to be aligned, what you can do is you can go to snapping, turn it on, and enable this option here. Now, by default, when I now move this around, you can see how it snaps to hotspots of the other layer. So for instance, it will snap to a corner, to the center, to the sides. If I want these guides to be extended, so here for instance also of my background layer, it can snap to the middle axis, the top and the corner and stuff like this. If I want it to be more like smart guides, you can enable this option here, and it will then look for extended things that it can snap to. Unfortunately, that's really unfortunate. This does not properly work for the anchor point because it's rotated. I mean, it's nice that it will extend it on this axis, but it would be nice if it extends it on this axis as well. Since it doesn't do that, I actually don't need this function. I can just have it snap onto the original object, click and drag it down, and then hold down the Shift key to constrain it to that axis. So now I know that these two are perfectly aligned. Then I do the same process. I go to the beginning of the timeline, select the object, hit P for the position, activate the stopwatch. The first keyframe is set automatically. Then I want it to end in the same spot that the previous animation ended. So I drag the slider and I hold down Shift. By holding down Shift, you can see how it kind of like snaps to the keyframe. Then I release the mouse, then the Shift key. Then we click and drag the object, move it over, hold down Shift. And here we kind of need to guess where this should be, or we could even take the exact values. So here we can see this is the exact position of our blue solid. So I can copy this value and I can paste it in here. And this way I also know that these are now perfectly aligned on top of one another. When I play this back, we have essentially created the exact same animation again, but this time I want to add some so-called easing. A keyframe can be eased by selecting it, or you can make a marquee selection. Don't click on the layer, then you move it. Click in the empty area here, and then you can click and drag to draw a selection. Then you right-click on the keyframes, you go to Keyframe Assistant, and choose Easy Ease. In the future, I will show you a way of doing this a little bit simpler, but since some companies don't allow you to install scripts, I want to show you how things work without scripts, and then later on kind of like make you use the scripts because life gets a lot simpler. But just in case you have to work somewhere where you don't have the scripts available, you should still know how the basics of After Effects work. So we click on Easy Ease, and you can see how the keyframes have changed. They now have this hourglass shape. And when we play this back, we can see how the animation now looks kind of different. It feels like it's... Oh, I did it on the wrong one. Let me reset this. Sorry. If you want to reset keyframes, simply click and drag them, hold down Command, and click on them. And then they are reset to linear keyframes. If you accidentally click a second time, they are other keyframes. We'll talk about them some other time. And if you click again, they go back to the linear keyframes. So command clicking resets the keyframes. Okay, so these are the new ones. Right click and easy ease. All right, when we now play it back, you can see how the top one still has the linear motion. So it starts abrupt and it has a constant speed and it stops abruptly. The bottom one, on the other hand, it starts slow, then it picks up speed, and then it slows down in the end. The overall length of the animation did not change. The beginning and the end are exactly the same, but the transition between position 1 and position 2 has changed, and this is referred to as easing. And right now, we just have a little bit of an easing. Let's now see what it would look like if we add a stronger easing. Because the default one is kind of subtle. Like if you don't have the blue one as a reference, you could almost think that this is a linear animation, because there's not that much stuff happening. Only when we compare it to the first one, we see that it definitely has some easing on it, even if it's just a little bit. So let's see what we could do. Let's create another solid, and let's actually take the solid that we already have and duplicate it. So we hit Command D to duplicate it. If you want to see the position keyframes, you can either hit P, and you can see the keyframes were copied as well, or alternatively, you can hit the shortcut U. U just looks through all the properties that After Effects has, looks if it has keyframes, and if it does, it will reveal them. So by hitting U, it shows me those keyframes. I could now take this object and I can move it down, but you can see how it will only move down this keyframe and not the other one. If I want both keyframes to be moved down, what you need to do is make sure that your slider is not in between. It has to be on one of the keyframes. It doesn't matter if it's the first or the last one. Then both keyframes need to be selected. And now you can move it down, and you can see how the animation is being moved down as well. To change the color of this solid, let's copy the next color, select the solid, and then you go to Layer and Solid Settings, or use the shortcut. Here we can now give it a different color. Then I hit U again so I can see my keyframes. I want to change the easing of these keyframes, and you do that by selecting the keyframes, right-clicking on it, and choose Keyframe Velocity. This now gives us values. The default values are 33%. If I use a higher value, it means that the easing will be stronger. So if I type in something like 66, by the way, I oftentimes use these kind of values like 66, 44, 55, just because it's a lot easier to type in. Like 50, it's like 2 steps. It's too hard, too much effort. So I usually just stick to something like 66, 22, and so on. So when I now hit OK, I don't see a difference here. However, if I play this back, I can see how this has even more character to the animation. It moves a lot faster, so we have a much stronger easing on there. If I want to compare this, I could also select all the layers, and you can see how we have these dots. These dots on the path represent the places that they have over time. So if I go through my composition one frame at a time by using Command and the left and right arrow keys, you can see how the anchor points are jumping from one dot to the next. Here we can see in the middle, the dots are much further apart, and in the beginning and the end, they are a lot closer together. And that means they move a lot slower in the beginning and the end. And in the middle, of course, they need to move a little bit faster to make up for the lost time. So, this easing can also be changed with a graph editor. When you select a position property, like so, don't click on the stopwatch. If you do that, you delete the keyframes and they're gone. You can only get them back by undoing, so Command Z. Click on the position property name and then enable this icon here, the graph editor. And here we can then see a curve. If this curve looks different for you, this sometimes happens, simply go down here to this option, choose the graph type, and choose the auto select graph type. And then it should look this way. Here, when we click on it, we can kind of see that this probably represents the 66% that I typed in. You can always click and drag these values to move them around. If you drag it longer, it means a higher value. If you make it shorter, it means a shorter value. If I drag it like this, it means that my easing will be very low in the beginning and very high in the end, which means it will be very fast in the beginning and very slow in the end. So the higher the value, the more slowing down it does. If I now play this back, it will be kind of like a bullet that is shot into water. In the beginning, it's fast, and then it slows down towards the end. I can now define how much easing I want, and usually I have a little bit of an easing in the beginning and a stronger easing in the end. All right. Let's now take a look at another type of keyframe. Let's go back to the beginning of the timeline and kind of do the same thing that we did earlier. We take our solid, hit Command D to duplicate it. We want to see the keyframes, so we hit the shortcut U. Make sure that you have your slider on one of the keyframes. Select both keyframes by making a marquee selection. Then you can hit Command D. Oh, sorry, we duplicated it before. Then we just click and drag it down, hold down Shift, release the mouse, release the Shift key. Now I do want to reset these keyframes to be linear keyframes, so I'll hold down the Command key on Windows, it would be Control, and I click on the keyframes. Then I will go to my color scheme and I will grab the next color. I select the solid, use the shortcut Command Shift Y, open up the color and paste it in. No, I copied it, I'm stupid. Paste. All right. Then what I want to do is I want to create more keyframes in between. So maybe one exactly in the center here. Let me zoom in. Then I can see my frames. So let's do something at, what is the middle of 25? That's an unfortunate distance. Let's move to 30 frames here. That would be a little bit easier. Let's just grab the keyframes and move them over. Now we made everything a little bit slower, as you can see. Then in the middle, which is I think at 15 now, is it? No, 25. I should have moved it just up to here. I'm stupid. Math is hard. So 15 should now be the center. There we go. I want to set another keyframe. So make sure that no layer is selected. Just click in an empty area here. And you can use this icon here to add another keyframe. And this adds a keyframe at the current time slider, current time indicator. Then I go roughly in the center here. And I add another one. And I go kind of over here. And I add another one. So now I just added a couple of keyframes. Right now it doesn't look like it's doing anything, but I can now select the keyframes, right click on them, and I can choose toggle hold. And this now means that it will hold the value of the keyframe until the next keyframe comes. And then it will hold that keyframe until the next one comes. So this way we are kind of creating a sort of stop motion animation. Alrighty. And these are the main types of keyframes. Now there are two more types. One of them you saw earlier, this big round one. And then there's a smaller round one as well. But these ones are the keyframes that we will take care of in our next session. Now before we finish this session, let me show you how you can render this out, because this will be the proof of attendance. Let's hit Command M to send this over to the render queue. Alternatively, you can also go up here to Composition and then say Add to Render Queue. Another alternative would be to use the Adobe Media Encoder, which is then Command Alt M. Actually, I think for today we will keep it simple and we'll just use the Adobe Media Encoder queue. So let's click on this one here and wait for the Media Encoder to open up and for the project to be opened up in the Media Encoder. Especially when it's the first time of you doing that, this might take a while. So the encoder, the first time it opens up, takes a long time, and then for the connection between After Effects and the Media Encoder to happen also takes quite a while. So give this a minute or 5. In the future, this will be a little bit faster. Okay, now we can see how it added our composition and it shows some kind of preset. This is usually the last one that you've chosen. I'm not sure what the default is, so my recommendation is, I will get into this in another session in more detail. On the left side here, click on the arrow and choose H.264. Then, on the preset, click on the arrow and choose Match Source Adaptive High Bitrate. Then, on the last one here, you need to define where it should be saved. Right now, I have not saved my After Effects file yet, so it will save this kind of like in a temporary folder, which is annoying. So click on the name and choose a different folder. So for instance, on the desktop. Then you simply hit the play button and it will start rendering the queue. Now before it starts, it actually needs to open up another instance of After Effects in the background of the Media Encoder before it can actually start rendering. So this will again take a little while. And again, in the future, this usually is a little bit faster. So let me just quickly skip ahead. Oh, I didn't have to. It's already done. Perfect. And now we have our video here of our nice little animation. All right, so this is your proof of attendance. Since the file is pretty small, you can just send it to me via email, but I would prefer to have it as a WeTransfer link. So for the people that don't know WeTransfer, let me just show it to you real quick. So just go to WeTransfer.com. Then you say that you don't want to sign up for an account, just say no thanks. Then the easiest option is to just get a link. So click on the dot and make sure that you don't choose the send email, but get a transfer link. Then you just take your MP4, drop it on here, it's added to the list, then you can get a link, it will upload, and then you can copy the link. Now a link always expires in a week, so I will then have 1 week to download it before the file is deleted. So just take this link and send it to me via email, and I would ask you to send me a separate email. So even though you've got an email from me for this session, sometimes people just click on reply to answer to it, but then it gets for me a little bit confusing who sent what where, and it's a lot easier for me to find things and organize things if you send me a separate email. So just send me an email calling it proof of attendance session 1 or After Effects session 1, and then put the link in there, and then we're golden. For the homework, what I want you to do is just animate something that is 10 seconds long. It doesn't really matter what it is. You can use the shapes that we've created here, and you can also import other elements. So for instance, I could import a video or an image by simply taking it from the Finder, or in Windows, the Explorer. Click and drag it into the field here. It will then import, and then I can click and drag it onto my timeline here. And you can see how I now have this video, and I can hide the other layers here, that I have this video playing back in here. Now you don't need to tell a story, it doesn't need to look pretty, I just want you to play around with keyframes and get used to the environment of After Effects. And for this, just create an animation that is 10 seconds long. Of course, you can try to tell a story, use emojis or whatever, little illustrations here to move them around, completely up to you. I just want to see that you use different types of keyframes over the course of 10 seconds. Then, just like we did here, send it over to the media encoder, create an MP4, and send me that MP4 as a WeTransfer link. And like I've mentioned in the beginning, the deadline is always the day before our next session. All right. I know today's session was a little bit boring. I promise you, the other sessions are a lot more interesting. We will make things that are a lot more practical than just diamond-shaped things moving from left to right. But yeah, good luck with the homework. And if you have any questions, let me know. See you then. Bye.